So we've heard a lot about the analysis based on empiricism of forest systems right across Europe. But of course, we're also interested in trying to explore the future as well. What is the future of forest systems? And to do that, of course, we can't observe the future, so we need a whole set of different methods to explore how the future may unfold. And that's what this component of Reclaim Forest is about. It's about integrated modelling of forest land use and management in order to understand the impacts of alternative future scenarios and to inform policy and policy pathways. Next slide, please. So the critical research questions that we are planning to address are primarily how will forest land uses and how will the management of those forests change in the future across Europe? And in particular, also, what will these changes in forest systems, what are the implications of these changes in terms of their impact on the broader environment? And that involves, for example, changes in carbon stocks and relationships to the regional climate, as well as the global climate. It means impacts on broader ecosystems and biodiversity. It might be impacts on water cycling, for example. But also we're interested in trying to explore how different policy interventions can influence the future directions of how the forest sector evolves going forward in terms of use and management. And of course, one of the critical questions that is always important to address within this broader context is how could we reconcile the challenges for climate change mitigation, primarily through carbon sequestration within future forests, but also reconcile that with the need to conserve biodiversity and halt the loss of biodiversity across Europe. So overall, we aim within Reclaim Forest to integrate a range of advanced computer models that will allow us to simulate future changes in European forests for a range of alternative scenarios that capture both changes in the future in the socioeconomic baselines, but also address questions related to climate change. And the next slide, please. And that computer framework broadly looks like this. So if you look at the central component, we have a model looking at subnational land use decision-making and decisions around management called the crafting model. Talk more about that in a moment, which links also into international trade models known as the Plum model to account for the fact that Europe isn't in isolation, that it's trading with the rest of the world, and we have to account for land-based commodity inflows and outflows. But we're also, a part of that, looking at the human system, interested in the institutions that are responsible for public policy. And so we're going to be exploring how we can model endogenously policy decisions as part of the broader forest land system. But importantly, related to that are a whole range of models that allow us to explore biophysical changes in forest systems, primarily looking at changes in plant growth, but also biogeochemical cycles through the LPJ GESS model, and links between LPJ GESS and the regional climate through the RCA GESS model. And we're also, most importantly, looking at the impacts on biodiversity through a model called Trait SDM, which looks at species distributions and consequences for biodiversity of changes in the land system itself. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'll hand you over to Paul Miller, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the LPJ GESS model.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Yes, so our tool for modelling the European forest ecosystems, both up to present day and into the future, is known as LPJ GESS, the Lund Potsdam Jena General Ecosystem Simulator. And it's a process-based second-generation dynamic vegetation model where we aim to simulate the forest composition and structure dynamically through time, from historical periods up to present day, and then from present day into the future following various scenarios that Mark just mentioned. So it's process-based. It takes as input carbon dioxide, nitrogen deposition inputs, and also the climate history and future scenarios. And also, of course, the land use and management scenarios that we wish to explore that will come from the LandSim setup. So we simulate processes such as primary production and growth, plant geography, soil biogeochemistry, and population dynamics and disturbance. And what they do is they combine to update dynamically the state of the forest in terms of its forest composition and its structure, and also the pools of carbon, nitrogen, and water geographically around Europe, but also the fluxes of water, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and BVOCs that were mentioned earlier. So we do this at a very detailed individual-based level. And what we're doing currently at the moment in the lead up to the full simulations for the entirety of Europe is that we're updating the model. So we're finalizing the main forestry and management functionality. There's a slide on that in the next slide. I'll come to that and I'll show you an example. We're improving the representation of the European tree species, which we'll be modeling. We're implementing the stand initialization functionality. So in other words, to try to generate this present state of European forests as informed by the other work packages that you heard earlier in terms of age classes and the type of species that exist where. And then, of course, we're using the other our colleagues' work, including, for example, NFI stem density, biomass growth rate data, and remote sense data to update and calibrate the model parameters to get a better representation of the present day functionality. And we're also then, of course, further calibrating and evaluating the model using the data such as forest harvest rates, the data coming from ICOS, the fluxes, the remote sensing, etc. And also, of course, as we heard earlier, as we heard from Svein, we also expect our forests to be experiencing increased levels of disturbance in the future. And that comes from wildfire, storm damage, and bark beetles, for example. So we're implementing that functionality in the model as well, so that we can explore the impacts of those disturbances in the future and how best to avoid them, and the resilience question. So we're selecting various climate scenarios from Europe, and we'll be using those then to project forward in time for multiple climate scenarios and also the land use scenarios that we'll arrive at in this project. So next slide, please. So just as an example, could you just click once again, James, please? So there's various, what functionality exists in the model. So we have various, the facility to simulate various management systems, such as uneven age forestry and even days forestry. And then within those systems, we have various management options, such as planting of specific tree species at a certain densities, reestablishment, thinnings, rotation times can be varied, clear cuts can be implemented or not, and we can select species cutting, and then of course we have fertilization of nitrogen and maybe irrigation as well, and maybe even fire suppression and different types of management change. So we can implement those and explore the effect of those management options on the ecosystem service that we're interested in. So next, just as an example then, as just an example of the type of simulation, that the output that we get from an example from a paper by Mats Lindeskog. So for a site in south of Sweden, so here we just have implemented, so if you just look at the bottom figure here, the time series, so we have a natural forest, and in 1900, we plant a spruce monoculture, and then we thin it automatically through the years until the year 2012, and then we clear cut it and plant a mixed broadleaf forest, and then there's implementation of automated thinning as well in the future, and then a clear cut at a later date. So what we're showing here, a graph, is vegetation carbon, and we can see how that changes over time. And in the top time series, we can see the harvested carbon over this time period as well in response to those thinnings and those clear cuts. So that's the type of thing we can simulate in the model, not just for one point, but for the entirety of Europe. Next slide, please. And then to capture the feedbacks, of course, this is an offline model. In its standard guise, LPGS takes as input of climate and produces simulates the dynamic state of the ecosystems. But of course, we expect feedbacks to occur as land use changes, as forest management changes, and as the fluxes change. So what we will do then is we will couple together this model LPGS with a regional climate model, which normally in their standard guise just use static inputs of land surface characteristics. So we will put this output of dynamic land use change and vegetation change in as the boundary condition for the regional climate model, set up for simulate for a European domain. So that will include, for example, the leaf area index, the type of vegetation that occurs where, for example. And then next clicking one more time, James. And then it would produce weather and climate. And of course, then it will be fed in, and that will be used in turn to feed into the LPGS model. So the LPGS model will respond to the simulated climate, and the climate will respond to the simulated vegetation. So in turn, you get a closed loop for the biogeophysical feedbacks that we expect in these scenarios. So this model setup is known as RCA GESS. So we'll be running that as well, maybe in a year or two. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. I'll take over again. Right, so we've heard something from Paul about the biophysical modelling, but of course central to understanding how forest systems will evolve into the future is around the decisions made by individual forest owners and forest managers. And in order to evaluate those types of responses to future scenario changes in the socioeconomic baseline or the climate baseline, we'll be modelling with an agent-based model called Crafty, which is a pan-European model. So we're going to be doing wall-to-wall analysis of changes in land use and management within the forest system for every European country, plus some additional countries outside of the European Union. The idea of this model is we want to model, we want to focus on the behaviours of individual land users and land managers that underpins the decision-making of those individual land users. But we also, as part of that modelled analysis, look at the interactions between individuals within broader societies and communities. We're looking at issues around, for example, the exchange of knowledge and information between individuals and how that can influence the propagation of knowledge and thought around how management should evolve in response to changing conditions in the future. We also have a keen interest in trying to understand and evaluate pathways to achieve policy goals, which are both current policy goals related to forest systems. For example, the EU biodiversity strategy of planting 3 billion new trees by the year 2030 would be one example, but also in trying to understand the emergence of future policy goals and the types of pathways that might be possible to achieve those goals. And to do that, we're building a novel representation of public policy institutions within the Crafty model itself. So we're effectively endogenizing the policy-making process within our models, which will allow us to then couple the policy process with the responses of individual land managers on the ground. So that's quite a novel approach to trying to model these policy pathways to these future goals.